Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. This is the Foreign Policy Primer for U.S. Congressional Candidates launch event. We are joined by Ann Wright, retired U.S. Army colonel and diplomat turned activist, David Swanson, an author, activist at World Beyond War and RootsAction, amongst other places and things, and Emma Claire Foley, who's research and policy team at Global Zero. So thank you all for being here. Much appreciated. We are going to start. I'm going to introduce the program real quick, and then we will get started right away. As we go through this, if you have any questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A on the Zoom, and feel free to interact in chat and comment in the chat, and we will see that and try to engage with all the attendees as much as possible. So why we are here is to discuss U.S. militarism, out-of-control Pentagon spending, and why it's critical for every candidate for U.S. Congress to have a developed foreign policy platform. That's the genesis of this event. Too many candidates, sometimes with otherwise good platforms, say nothing or very little on foreign policy, despite so much of our discretionary spending going to so-called defense and foreign policy. That led RootsAction's own David Swanson to write this beautiful guide, Foreign Policy Primer for U.S. Congressional Candidates, which he is going to get to more here shortly. But first, we're going to talk with Ann Wright, who's going to lay out U.S. foreign policy as it is right now, the context for U.S. foreign policy, and essentially lead into why it's so important that candidates actually care about this stuff, because there is a lot going on. So, Ann, why don't you give us a little context? What's going on with U.S. foreign policy?
Okay, well, thank you, Ryan, and it's great to be here with RootsAction and World Beyond War. It is very important that we educate our potential legislators, our congressmen and women, whether they're in office now, which many of them still need education, and particularly those that are running for office. An interesting thing, we call it foreign relations, but it's really not foreign, it's international. And that moniker that still stays with it after all these decades is really quite strange. I myself was a U.S. diplomat for 16 years. I served in U.S. embassies in Nicaragua, Grenada, Somalia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Sierra Leone, Micronesia. I helped reopen the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan in December of 2001. And then I was in Mongolia, the U.S. Embassy there, when I resigned in March of 2003 against the U.S. war on Iraq. And since then, as you've mentioned, I've been an activist in terms of challenging all of these presidential administrations on their international policies. Before I was a U.S. diplomat, I was also in the U.S. military for 29 years, 16 on active duty and 13 in the reserve. So most of my adult life, I've been involved in some aspect, either the war making, official war making through the military, or the unofficial war making, which is through the State Department. And I will go into that just a little bit right now. I would like to share, and right now it's saying only host. Let's see, all panelists. Could somebody give the all panelists sharing options? Oh, let's try it again. It says only host. Who's got the controls?
You should have it now, Ann. Try
Okay.
again.
All right. It still says only host instead of all panelists.
You are the host right now, Ann.
Well, it's
Could I'm seeing it says you are viewing David Swanson's screen. David, could you try to unshare? Is there something maybe going on with that?
I shared and unshared a while ago. I can share and unshare again.
well, I think I may have it now.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Let's just try that. Yeah. Yep, there it is. And so here's the first screen that we have, the primer on U.S. foreign policy. And again, I appreciate what you all have done. U.S. foreign policy or U.S. international policy. A quick question is, do we have an even-handed policy toward other nations, or do we have a confrontational international policy? I would say that as much as I was hoping that the Biden administration would be a little more even-handed than the Trump administration was, or times of the Obama administration, that indeed right now we do have a confrontational foreign policy. If you look at one of the slides that will be in the excellent 30-page guide to U.S. foreign policies that we're talking about, this primer, one of the pictures in it is a picture of my old boss, my last boss in the State Department, who was Colin Powell. And he's one of the foreign Secretary of States that have lied us into wars. And here's a picture of him at the UN Security Council for the Gulf War in 2003, where they were talking and knew there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iran, but were talking to us. He's the chief diplomat, the chief international relations person. And I would say that his successors have not been much better than he has been in terms of also being warmongers. Warmongering right now is on steroids. And we can talk about, in military terms, our U.S. foreign policy or international policy. It is a weaponized foreign policy. Militarism and the threats of war are the foundation right now of the Biden administration's foreign policies. It is heartbreaking to see that we have to have enemies. The U.S. foreign policy, international policy, has to have foreign policies, and we can see very distinctly right now in U.S. relations with China and then particularly with Russia, whereas today the spokesperson for the White House said it's almost imminent, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Well, I'll just stop at this point to say, when we start talking to potential legislators about all of these issues, we can't do it in a vacuum. We have to give them a little more information about the history of how this has occurred. And if you look at the history of what is going on, let's just say with Russia right now, and forget to talk about the 2014 US-sponsored coup of the Ukraine, which precipitated this whole thing to include the later annexation of Crimea by Russia after a plebiscite by the Crimeans, then you're missing the whole point of why the Russians are upset, plus the historical fact that the US and NATO countries' agreement with Russia, although it's verbal, and that's why Putin right now is saying, I want everything in writing, because he doesn't want to have a Gorbachev done on him, where countries say, oh, we won't poach on the countries of Eastern Europe that are right on the border with Russia. So these are some of the things that we have to remind these legislators, potential ones, many of whom are very, very young. I mean, I'm 75. I can remember most of this. Some of our younger people that are running for office don't remember any of this stuff. How about China? I mean, China, for the last 20 years, 25 years, China and Russia have been good friends of the United States. China has been our greatest economic trading partner. China has kept us clothed. China has kept us with mobile devices. China has kept us with all sorts of things. And then under the Obama administration, here we go. We need another threat. The war on Iraq is winding down. So let's pivot to the Pacific. And living out here in the Pacific, I can tell you the mobilization of the U.S. military to go to the Western Pacific to have freedom of navigation, which really is just a euphemism for an armada, a naval armada that is going up and down the coast of China. And China does respond, although not much. I mean, they have one aircraft carrier and they've got a flotilla of tiny fishing vessels, and they have created some military outposts on these atolls, which are inside what they call their nine line of defense. But let's remind these potential legislators of the history that it hasn't been. I mean, we've had 25 years, 30 years of essentially economic competition with Russia, but not this military competition. And then you go on to Iran. Well, you know, with the Trump administration pulling out of the very good thing that the Obama administration did of the joint comprehensive agreement on nuclear weapons. And we certainly hope that in Geneva that there are discussions, positive discussions going on with the Iranian government and with the European governments who are very, very anxious to go ahead and get the agreement back in effect with Iran. North Korea, well, they just keep firing off missiles now, 4 of them in the last 2 weeks, saying, we would like to have your attention. We are out here still. We do have a few nuclear weapons. The U.S. itself continues to berate the nuclear weapons program of North Korea, which the U.S. position is, until you give up your nukes, we're not going to talk to you. Although the South Koreans and the U.S. have had an agreement, still secret agreement, on something along the lines of less in the war with North Korea. The North Koreans, I think these missiles are kind of a signal saying, yeah, maybe we want to talk finally. And I put in here Afghanistan, the threats of war. Well, let's not forget what's happening to the poor people of Afghanistan, where the international community has frozen all the funds that could be there to help the people that the U.S. and the Western countries were supposedly a 20-year war to help the people of Afghanistan against against the Taliban, et cetera. And now that the U.S. pulled out, very poorly pulled out, I'm glad that we're out, but it was done in a very poor fashion. But the fact that the U.S. and Western and international organizations have frozen a huge amount of money that it is really necessary to keep people in Afghanistan alive. So we're weaponizing the U.S. foreign policy based on wars. A war by another name is called sanctions. And if you look at the numbers of countries that the U.S. is threatening with war, but right now has very, very debilitating sanctions on: North Korea, a poverty-stricken country, Iran, Russia. The Russians, though, they say, well, in one way, this hadn't been too bad for us because it's forced us to look inward, and we've developed our own industries. We can be more self-sufficient than we were before you all did this to us. But it would be better. We wouldn't have, if we didn't have sanctions on people, and there could be, a non-sanctioned world. China has certain sanctions that have been put on senior leaders, but they have such an economic powerhouse. It would really be tough if they would put sanctions on the U.S. We would not last very long, I'm afraid. We're not very, what do you call it? Not reliable, but resilient. Yeah. And then you look at the other places of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, where all you have to do is say we're a socialist or a communist country, and all of a sudden you're in everybody's doghouse. And that is proven for the last 60 years in Cuba and 35 years in Nicaragua and 15 years in Venezuela. And then again, sanctions on poor old Afghanistan, where the leadership of the Taliban are sanctioned. Oh yeah, there is this thing called diplomacy. But to get around to the other part of foreign policy or international policies, there certainly are plenty of opportunities that we need to be pushing these new legislators or candidates. The Biden administration has signed an agreement with the Russians on the START treaty, but there are plenty of other arms control treaties that the U.S. has pulled out of that we need to get back into for the safety and security of the world. And I'll give credit certainly to the Biden administration for going back into the Paris Treaty, and to the extent that maybe behind the scenes they are starting to talk with the Iranians. And this whole issue of end of the Korean War is so important that we work with all of these countries on a diplomatic, respectful tone and approach. And this confrontation that seems to be kind of what our Secretary of State Blinken and the National Security Advisor Sullivan are doing, in my opinion, is not helpful at all. Some of the questions I think that we could ask any of these new candidates for national office: will you vote for reducing the massive military budget that we have? Do you believe in the fair treatment of Palestinians? Would you vote to close Guantanamo? Will you work for the no extradition, stop the extradition of Julian Assange? Will you vote against weapons sales to Saudi Arabia? Will you join the Caucus to end the war that Saudi Arabia and all have in there? And will you help reestablish relations with Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua and take the sanctions off? So those are some of the things that I think that we can do with new or potential members of Congress. And we can also go after those current sitting members of Congress. So again, I want to thank the World Beyond War and RootsAction for this excellent guide, this primer to foreign policy for the new candidates that we have, and go after all of these guys and gals and let's get their opinions and educate them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ann. There's so much going on when you really think about how confrontational the U.S. is. Quick question. I think I saw a Gravel Institute video on this, but how many countries would you say the U.S. is at war with right now?
Oh, gosh. Well, undeclared wars in the Middle East. And if you look at where the U.S. has military training groups in there that can be turned very quickly, like the military training groups that we have in Ukraine right now, that we have in all over Africa. David's probably the better person that can come up with the number on it, but there's plenty of military actions in a lot of countries of the world.
Right. And someone was saying in chat too, I forget who it was, but sanctions are, just like war, it's killing people slowly versus quickly. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Ann. We're going to move on to our next bit here. Now, David, who actually wrote this primer, felt it was obviously very necessary that we needed this. So David, from your experience, candidates in foreign policy, they're just not knowledgeable about it. They don't talk about it. What's going on there?
You want me to do my PowerPoint presentation, or just you want me to answer that question?
Go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint presentation. We'll get right into this. I guess you can talk about too the genesis of creating this document as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to start a little 10-minute timer here, see what I can do. I wanted to ask, I don't know how many of you can see, how many others, or there's any way to see most of the people, but I wanted to ask people to raise their hand if they've already read the primer, because I was interested in whether anybody's read it. I don't know if anyone can see any answer to that, but let me go ahead and share my screen and try and start a little slideshow here.
And Sam, if you could post the primer again in the chat real quick so people can pull it up.
Will do.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's worth mentioning that earlier this evening, President Biden was doing a press conference and predicted that they don't say the Russian government, they don't even say Putin anymore, they just say he, and everybody knows who it is, that he would invade Ukraine. And then he was asked by another eager so-called journalist to repeat that. And he declined, and he said, actually, it just depends on which side of the bed he wakes up on, as if, Russia is controlled by an irrational toddler, whereas, in fact, the demands that Russia is making are the absolutely identical to the demands that the United States would be making if there were a missile in Cuba. So this is, to answer your question, Ryan, this is where this came from. Back in 2020, I did this other little report looking at all of the Democratic incumbents and successful newcomers campaign websites for the U.S. House of Representatives. And 22% of them had no platform whatsoever. I mean, you're just voting for their smile or their kids or whatever. You're not voting for anything. But 71% of them had no foreign policy platform, no wars, no peace, no treaties, no budget, no, nothing. And of the new Democrats who got elected that year, 66% of them had no foreign policy, no platform that could be found on the websites. And then that fraction that have something to say, sometimes a little bit in depth, mostly very vague and short, 74% of them favored continued or increased militarism, whereas 14% of them backed decreased militarism. So, this is the starting point where I thought, something was needed. This is, part of what's in the primer with this colored graph that Ryan made, that is the spending that Congress members are going to oversee, the discretionary spending, meaning the spending that they have some say over, that they decide on each year. The majority of it is militarism. The rest of the world is 96% of humanity, right? And these candidates have not one word. So they're sort of applying for the other 40% of the job. And they're missing or intentionally evading the fact that unlike any other national government, unlike any local or state government, with the US government, you're trying to get a job in an institution that is primarily a war machine. And so RootsAction, we hear from candidates, we talk to candidates, we ask them why they don't have any foreign policy. And a lot of times they say, with whatever degree of honesty, well, I don't know anything about foreign policy. So to at least take away that excuse and to help out those who really sincerely want to know something, we created this thing. And sort of combining the information from a number of sections in the primer, I made an effort to try to communicate the rather unique role that the U.S. government plays in the world, looking at weapons dealing, looking at so-called aid, where U.S. foreign aid is, tiny fraction of a percent of U.S. spending, but 40% of it is weapons. Bases, 80-90% of foreign military bases on Earth are U.S. foreign military bases. Rogue status, the leading major holdout on central human rights treaties, disarmament treaties, and routine shredder and terror upper of treaties to which it is party, not to mention non-treaty agreements. The frequency of threatening war and launching war and committing these crimes, and there's a section on war powers as well. But it's just incredible. If I can fit this in, I'd want to read a teeny bit out of what's in the primer. The U.S. military spending dwarfs the cost of most infrastructure and social needs spending legislation, the cost of any other item or dozen items of discretionary spending, and the military spending of any other nation. In 2020, U.S. military spending was more than that of the next 11 biggest spenders combined, 9 of which nations were U.S. weapons customers, pressed by the U.S. government to spend more. And the next 14 biggest spenders after those top 12, the only other ones to spend more than 1% of U.S. military spending, of those 14, 11 were U.S. weapons customers. In 2020, military spending per capita, U.S. again at the top, and 21 of the next 22 were U.S. weapons customers. It's hard to find a war without U.S. weapons on both sides. Try to present the need to Congress members and potential Congress members to be prepared to be lied to. There's not been a major U.S. war without Congress being lied to by the White House, by the Pentagon, by other members of Congress. And I included some documentation on what drives the spending, the confessions of Pentagon officials that it's the profits, it's the bureaucracy, the performance of Congress routinely giving the military more money than it even wants, and the counterproductive nature, the way that more spending produces more wars, more so-called counterterrorism generates more terrorism, more bases generate more wars near those bases rather than preventing them, and so forth. The U.S., is the leading armor and supplier and assister of the most oppressive governments around the world, some of them propped up by these bases, using the US government's own identification of which are the oppressive governments. Next slide. So then there are, as Ann mentioned, diplomacy is an option, right? And so there are some sections included in this primer on what could be done instead, and some information on how popular peace is, and what the better platforms have been of candidates who have successfully gotten themselves into Congress campaigning for peace and demilitarization. As Dr. Martin Luther King said, it's nonviolence or non-existence. This is, we need better than what the very best progressives in Congress are saying, much less doing now, to survive, not to suit some ideology or lifestyle, just to survive. We need to shift resources to emergencies that need to be addressed, to upholding rather than tearing down the rule of law, to cooperation, to transition, to a Green New Deal, to even, dare I say, a bit of humility and learning from other countries, rather than holding democracy summits and preaching at other countries. There are a couple of statistics here that begin to hint at what could be done with U.S. military spending if redirected, that you could end starvation with $30 billion a year, 3% of $1 trillion. You could end the lack of clean drinking water for $11 billion a year, 1% of $1 trillion. So, there are incredible, unbelievable things that could be done with these resources that are being invested in this counterproductive criminal enterprise. And people don't know, or at least don't talk about it. And we don't know to what extent people just need the information, or they're unable to process information that they are well paid not to be able to process. But we've taken away the excuse and educating some people in the process, and hopefully the resource will be of use to people who aren't running for Congress as well. But we hope everybody will take it and get their so-called representative and candidates to be representatives and senators to read it and use it. Thanks. Take it away.
Thank you so much, David. Hopefully we are getting rid of the excuse of they don't know anything about it now, and we can spread this as much as possible. And hopefully get some candidates this cycle and next and moving forward that are really serious about foreign policy. And some of those foreign policy issues, our next speaker, Emma Claire Foley, happens to be an expert at. Emma's is on the research and policy team at Global Zero. Emma, how are you?
Doing great, thanks. Happy to be here.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being here. Some of the things we touch on in the primer, David touches on in the primer, things like ICBMs, nuclear weapons, and one of the big ones that Ann touched on as well is U.S. and Russia relations. So I want to talk about a couple of those, but let's first start with ICBMs. U.S. spending a ton of money on ICBMs, potentially moving on to spend more money on the GBSDs, the next iteration of our ICBMs. What's going on there? Why are we spending money there? What could we be doing instead? What is the foreign policy move that candidates should be thinking about in regards to ICBMs or maybe nuclear weapons more generally?
For sure. Well, I can give just a brief rundown of what's going on with the ICBMs and then kind of relate it back to nuclear weapons issues in general and what I think that this primer is trying to do, which I think is really positive. So I work on efforts to cancel what's called the GBSD, as you refer to, the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent Program, which would replace U.S. land-based missiles that are currently in 5 states in the upper Midwest and Mountain West. They're in underground silos on people's farms, on just, very out of the way, sort of nondescript areas on the side of the road. But each of these weapons contains an incredible destructive power, many times more than those that were used in Japan at the end of the Second World War. So it's really hard to think about what that means in terms of what these weapons can actually do and what they mean for, how the US thinks about its foreign policy, that it maintains this option at all times on high alert. They could be launched within minutes. And it also, the fragility of that region of the country, which is sort of, is one of the most beautiful places in the United States. It's a place that has, a booming energy sector now. It's a place where there are a lot of conflicts over tribal lands. It's incredibly diverse, and at the same time, you're looking at it, and it's like the purpose of these weapons and the purpose of sort of the Russian counterpart, because that's how this is set up since the early 60s. These sort of two nuclear weapons forces on the U.S. and Russia side have sort of existed to cancel each other out. At any moment, it could all be gone. And of course, it would not just be that part of the country. The effects would reverberate all over the world. But, it's especially poignant when you sort of look at it that way. So a lot of nuclear weapons experts, sort of all stripes, have come to the conclusion that these weapons are not only unnecessary, even if you're a believer in nuclear deterrence, that the US has so many nuclear weapons at this point, nearly 6,000, that it simply doesn't need these, but also that they're inherently destabilizing for a couple reasons. One is that they're kept on high alert, as I said, so they could very easily be launched in response to a false alarm, as has almost happened several times. This has been documented. And once they're launched, they cannot be recalled. So there's a very real possibility at any moment that in response to false information, the US or Russia will launch a massive nuclear attack. The other country will respond, and then it's, it's nuclear war. It is what it is. So that's like the sort of simplest and I think probably the most compelling reason you can give for why we shouldn't have these weapons. But there are other reasons, including that their replacement will cost almost $300 billion. And when you were looking at, a few months ago, and we thought we might get some, really needed basic social programs, some legislation through the Build Back Better negotiations, that number kept coming up as sort of an unreachable number for, healthcare expansion, for any number of these demands that we had. And, you listen to it when you're thinking about nuclear weapons and you're like, well, I have an idea for where we could get that money. So essentially that's the idea, is that if we cancel this program, if we get rid of these weapons, we're safer. And for people who think in terms of a balanced budget, which is something that I think is you're going to see if you're talking to Congress, you can see this as a trade-off. If you're going to cancel these weapons, you can put it into things that are actually necessary for sustaining the health and well-being of people in the United States. Another angle of this is that what you hear a lot from the defense industry, and what I'm seeing a little bit of echoes of this in the chat, is that this and sort of many of these other programs are thought of as jobs programs. They're kind of the only major way that like the US government currently feels empowered to invest in job creation, in sort of, what is billed as like supporting American workers. When in fact, even if you take these claims on good faith, they don't make a lot of sense. Almost any other industry, as it says in the report, would be more productive in terms of increasing jobs. And in the ICBM states, we've seen this when new healthcare facilities open, things like that. That's actually a much better job creator than more nuclear weapons. So this, I think, is a huge opportunity for people who are running for Congress, for existing members of Congress who want to figure out how to bridge the divide between foreign and domestic policy, if we're choosing to call them that. I think there's a good reason why foreign policy doesn't come up a ton in terms of elections, which is that with the exceptions of things like trade and certain other things, moments at which there needs to be a sense that of consent from the American people to go to war, people don't really feel connected to foreign policy unless they have family in the military or something like that. And I think an opportunity for people who are interested in signing on to this kind of foreign policy platform would be to find these places where we can really show how they're the same thing. If we address this complex foreign policy issue of U.S. and other countries' continued reliance on nuclear weapons, we can start making strides on these fundamental, domestic issues of our crumbling social safety net. If there are other questions about the ICBM issue or maybe how it relates to U.S.-Russia stuff, we can also talk about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I did want to quickly dip into U.S.-Russia relations because I know that's something you focus on, and I know nuclear weapons are obviously at the core of that relationship in a lot of ways. With what's going on in Ukraine, could you talk a little bit about why the U.S. Seems to want tension with Russia so often, and why candidates don't really address it much? And it's more of we let Russia be like a boogeyman a lot of the time, and no one's going to jump to defend them or anything like that. Can you talk to us a little bit about that context with the U.S.-Russia relationship?
Absolutely, yeah. While not denying that U.S.-Russia relations are tricky and something that need to be handled carefully and with a lot of background knowledge, which, as we've been discussing, I think is something that a lot of people come into office without, understandably. I think if you take a view of this relationship that encompasses things like nuclear weapons, like risk reduction, and thinking holistically about the U.S.'s role in relationship with Europe as well as Russia, it becomes less about these very intense moments where we do start to psychologize Russian leaders in a way that is pretty unproductive, or what you saw during the Trump administration, where Russia is sort of uncritically blamed for the malfunctions of the U.S. government system, which are obviously, of our own making, no matter what's going on. So I would say that if you're talking to someone who is planning on running for office, or who's currently in office and is interested in kind of developing their approach to foreign policy with Russia in a way that fits with a more progressive or left platform generally, I would focus, of course, on the nuclear weapons issue to a pretty substantial degree. Thinking about how committing to diplomacy around nuclear weapons, as the U.S. is obligated to do, is a way that we can build a rapport with a country with whom we absolutely need that rapport to address other complicated problems such as climate change, which I feel like really gets lost in discussions of U.S.-Russia relations to all of our detriment, because that is where that relationship is heading. And this sort of the saber rattling we're seeing, while it's obviously consequential, is to some extent, kind of can be a momentary distraction from what should actually be the goals of a healthy U.S.-Russia relationship.
Gotcha. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Emma. I really appreciate it. I think it's about 8:42 now. I think it's about time to move into the Q&A now. I know we have several really strong, we have a lot of questions. All right, we're going to get to as many of these as we can. I didn't realize I had a second page to scroll through. So we'll start at the top. And so Ann, Emma, David, whoever wants to answer these, feel free to hop in. There'll be different expertise for different questions, I'm sure, but all of you feel free to hop in as you feel fit. Steve asks, How worthwhile is the Lee-Pocon Defense Spending Reduction Caucus? Should we push our representatives to join it? David?
I'm happy to speak to that one if nobody else wants to, although they may want to disagree with me once they've heard what I have to say, because my answer would be absolutely worthless. If you're going to have a caucus that doesn't dare to have a public face, an existence, a website, a press release, not even, it's not even one of these caucuses that puts out nice press releases. It's just nothing, just doesn't exist. And then have absolutely not a single member of the House of Representatives try to organize a single other member to vote against the military spending bill. One senator out of 100, Bernie Sanders, make a speech and try to get other senators to vote against it. That's it, a caucus of one. And in the House, just about everybody either voting for the military spending bill or waiting and making sure it's going to pass and not saying one word against it and then voting against it for looks. And when you're going to have a president come in the Democratic Party, on the Democratic Party platform that promised reduced military spending and propose significantly increased military spending, like Trump got it just right, only we needed more. And the word you get from these leading progressives is, yeah, we're down with that. We're going to pretend it never even happened, but we're going to oppose with, very polite statements, any further increases by the Republicans in the Congress above Biden's totally acceptable, never happened, increased request. If that's the standard, forget it. What do we need a caucus for? What do we even need a promise to vote the right way when they routinely go back on their word? What we actually need is public efforts by Congress members to organize other Congress members to do the right thing, meaning not vote no once you're sure it's going to pass with enough yeses, but try to block the thing. And that can take a little strategy. But if you had a bill with just a little bit more anti-racism in it, you would have got the Republicans voting no, and then you would have had enough progressives voting no to actually block the thing. But to actually block the thing and change it before it passes is just not even on the radar. It's just not even fathomed by the imagination or dreams of these people. So, yeah, I'm not impressed, I guess.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, if they would be more serious of a caucus, then maybe there'd be some value there. But yeah, it seems with no face or anything, it's how do you do anything? How do you hold water there? Next question, Jordan asks, given how much of a third rail Palestine-Israel policy is and how dangerous for candidates it can be to stray from unquestioning support for Israel, how can a progressive candidate who supports Palestinian rights frame their position without sabotaging their campaigns? And they point to Nina Turner's campaign as an example where that became used against her. So anyone on Israel, Palestine, and how progressives can, Ann, go ahead.
Sure. Well, it takes courage, it takes guts, it takes backbone, it takes developing, a story of why all people should have human rights, that they should be respected, all of that. And then, being willing to keep after it and to keep talking about it and not let what is very expected and anticipated, which would be a big backlash, to go after it. It also depends on the part of the country you're running in. I mean, there are some parts of the country you might have to move to actually run on a platform of equal rights for Palestinians, because we have to acknowledge there are parts of our country that just will not hear it. But if you go up to the upper Midwest, you go to Detroit, you go to some of those places, you're going to find a good group. But it is a challenge, and it takes people with integrity and strength and willingness to really talk to people and not let the blast take you down. Thank you.
I think that's right. Yeah, it's a sustained thing that has to keep going to change the conscious of the country. Next question, Josh asks, why do you focus on turning congressional representatives around? I ask in the context of rigged elections and two parties that are both locked into pro-war positions. I imagine rigged elections being like against Bernie in the primary kind of situation, locked in a pro-war position. What options do we have besides trying to influence Congress? Emma.
I think this is a tough question, but it's one that I'm really interested in as someone who's really invested in, domestic political organizing from a democratic socialist perspective, as well as the work that I do for my job. I think you're right that the party system at this point is, pretty much precludes a third party challenger or someone who strays particularly far from from either party line. But I mean, I think that is something that will benefit from sustained organizing. And so it's important to not, when you're talking about foreign policy, say like, oh, well, we'll deal with that when we've solved these other prior problems, because everything is happening all at once. Everything is urgent. And there are steps that we can take now. But I would say that that's one reason why I think it's so important to figure out ways to connect these issues to things that are happening to people in their communities, in their lives every day. Because that is where we're going to build power in order to shift the things that are happening at this high level. As just an overall mission for how we can deal with that problem, that's how I tend to think of it.
I think that makes sense. David, were you hopping in as well?
Well, I think we're focusing on Congress on a webinar about Congress. We're not necessarily focusing on Congress every minute of our lives, and there's tons of great work going on in terms of public education on these issues, in terms of activism, in terms of putting bodies in front of weapons shipments, getting divestment from financial institutions out of weapons, getting bases blocked in collaboration with activists in the places where they're trying to build the bases around the world, building up support for international law. I mean, there's just endless opportunities for activism, local, global, and every level in between. Congress is just one little bit of it.
I think that's absolutely true too. Yes, lots of tactics, lots of things we can do. Timothy asks, how do we strengthen and maintain institutions that keep the peace and prevent aggression, the likes of what Russia is engaged in Ukraine right now? So I guess the start of that question, what are some options to embrace in policy when the foreign actors are engaged in war tactics? So what can we do to strengthen the institutions that promote peace?
Well, I'd certainly like to speak to that, but somebody else may want to go first. Well, I think we don't have the hours to go into the history of how this has developed in Ukraine, but I think it's worth recognizing that it takes at least two to tango, and that the United States promised not to expand NATO, expanded NATO, put missile bases on Russia's border, put giant military war games on Russia's border, armed a government in Ukraine that came out of a US-supported anti-Russian coup in 2014, has been working to get Ukraine into NATO despite Russia's demand that it will not feel safe if Ukraine is in NATO. And it was a buildup of troops and weapons within Ukraine that precipitated the buildup of Russian troops outside Ukraine. And so to take that situation, which if it were in Ontario or Mexico or Cuba, would certainly not be depicted as the US being the aggressor, and label it a problem of Russian aggression is not 100% wrong. There's not an absence of Russian aggression, but it misses the basic story, right? And so how do you turn that around? Well, the demands that Russia is making are not that you give up Jesus Christ or become a communist or, shut down the Pentagon, or, Russia is demanding that you not have military alliances and military weapons and military war games on its border, which never happened in the old Cold War. That's all it's asking, right? And Biden was asked, to his great credit, unlike some of his other questions, David Sanger from the New York Times this evening at the press conference asked Joe Biden, is there any chance you'll actually meet these demands and undo this conflict and maybe start, talking about peace? And Biden said, absolutely not. He said, yes, maybe on weapons in Ukraine. We could do without weapons in Ukraine, but we will never, ever say that Ukraine can't join NATO. We might stall it. We might hold it off for unspecified amounts of time, but we can't say, no, it won't join NATO. And then there was the question, well, what about weapons in Eastern Europe outside of Ukraine? And Biden just was adamant. It is our sacred duty. These were his words, and if you read Andrew Coburn's recent book on spoils of war, this was a major motivation for expanding NATO eastward, selling all of these weapons in Eastern Europe. And it is Biden's sacred duty, even if it continues to fuel a possible third world war, a possible conflict between nuclear governments. It is his sacred duty to keep selling weapons in Eastern Europe. So, the weapons profits, the machismo, nobody wants a war, but nobody wants to back down. The bureaucratic inertia of NATO wanting some reason to exist. These are the things that need to be dealt with. And then you want to have institutions of peace. Well, rejoin all the treaties you've shredded, rejoin the Iran agreement and the anti-ballistic missile and the intermediate range missile and the Minsk agreements, and start making commitments and keeping them. It's not rocket science.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Emma, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add a really brief note to that because, an overview of institutions that oversee U.S.-Russia relations is pretty, disappointing if you're thinking about which ones are sort of advancing the cause of peace. But I would say that, I spent 2013 and 2014 actually living and working in Ukraine during the sort of Maidan Revolution and its aftermath. And one thing I remember a lot is talking to younger people in their teens, 20s, and 30s who had spent time living and working in the United States and watching during that time those opportunities disappear very quickly. And I think that if you're in Congress, you may have the opportunity to work on what feels like a very marginal issue of allowing more people to come to the United States and vice versa, to travel to Russia, to countries in Eastern Europe. And so this is just an example of one of these smaller issues that I feel like can really move these things forward, can encourage a kind of wider understanding of these issues, and have more people who are there interested in pushing for better outcomes. So the advice I would give is just look, it's a very complicated issue, and look at all sides of it. There are things you can do even when there are these massive forces that are, gunning for war at all costs, profit at all costs.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Sam, could you post the article we recently posted to Progressive Hub, the long write-up of the NATO expansion towards Russia? It was a really great write-up. So so Sam's going to put this in the chat, but if you want not a quick article, but a long article that explains NATO's eastward expansion. It's a really great piece. We still have a ton of questions. We are not going to get through them all. This is like a brilliant audience we have tonight. So all these questions are just like great. Ruth asks, would this primer be best used by our current congressional members? I'll answer that. Yeah, you can send this to current members as well as candidates. Whoever you want to send this to, absolutely go for it. In terms of a historical aggression, Gustavo wants to know the US, Russia, or China, who I don't think we need to answer this question. United States obviously has the most military bases. Yeah, okay. I think that question was a little more tongue-in-cheek. What about just transition? Sharon wants to know about how many people are promoting just transition programs to create jobs that can replace military and defense industry jobs. Do we know about the work going on there? Go ahead, Emma Claire.
I think this is a relatively unexplored territory, and one that I think has huge potential for progressive and left foreign policy movements going forward. If you look at the idea of reducing defense spending in Congress, it's extremely, disheartening that it's very, very difficult for Congress people to step away from the consensus that we have to just kind of sign a blank check, right? But I think that this is one way that we can sort of wedge in and really do the hard work of building support for alternate courses of action, a different way of doing things. I think nuclear weapons are especially good target for that because they are, because there's this really longstanding case for their elimination. There's legal precedent for it. There's a movement for it, and there are clear pathways for reinvestment of that money in a way that might be more complicated for other aspects of the defense establishment. But I would say that, learning from the work that's been done recently around the Green New Deal, around various recovery efforts that are trying to respond to COVID, things like that, all of these things which are bringing jobs programs, which are bringing intensive economic development back into the realm of possibility, I think are really positive and should really, really be taken up by people who are revisiting this idea of defense conversion or economic conversion as a way of reducing the US defense budget.
Can I add to that, Ryan? As a lot of you probably know, inspired by the work of Seymour Melman and others back in the day, there was regularly introduced in the U.S. Congress a bill to start a major conversion effort from war industries to peace industries that came relatively close to passing just before Kennedy was killed, that came relatively close to passing just before Newt Gingrich killed it off and denied us the peace dividend at the end, supposed end of the Cold War, but there's no need to reinvent, only to tweak. And there are localities and states that have done great studies and efforts, and there have been small scale conversion efforts very successful as part of COVID response. And it's absolutely ridiculous to be talking about a Green New Deal without conversion from militarism. So, the opportunity is there. The work has been done. It's just the political will. If
I could add, not on this particular thing, but the previous thing, and you mentioned the article that came out in the Progressive Hub. Well, I just looked it up, and a good friend of mine, Sharon Tennyson, wrote it. And I wanted to bring up what she does, which is citizen-to-citizen diplomacy, which can be is the most effective type. Leave the professional diplomats out and get the citizens in there. And she's taken thousands and thousands of U.S. citizens to Russia, and she's brought thousands of Russians to the United States. And she's worked in a community type thing where she got U.S. Rotary clubs to acknowledge that back in the 90s, when there was a transition from the communist state-controlled businesses to a more open thing, she had Rotarians come to Russia to talk about how business is done in the U.S., which may not have been quite the best thing to do, but it had the greatest number of interactions between U.S. and Russians. And in the last 5 years, she's been taking other taking groups of U.S. citizens back to Russia, and I've been on 2 of them. One in 2016, and our group went to Crimea and talked to the people of Crimea about the plebiscite and all that. And then the last one was in 2019. And when COVID relaxes, going to places like Russia, going to places like China, see with your own eyes what's going on, what the challenges are of each of the countries, their government challenges, all of this stuff, and talking in person with some citizens of these countries, and telling your congressmen and women they ought to do this and not go on just congressional delegations, but go honestly just to go talk to people. That really is good. And Sharon's book, something like The Power of Impossible Ideas. Hey, there it goes. David's got it. He wrote one of the best book reviews ever on any book, but on that one in particular is really good.
She's doing a book club with World Beyond War. You can talk about it with her. That's why I have a pile of them sitting here.
Nice. I talked to her.
Wonderful.
I talked to her a little bit about going on her next Russia trip, but it got postponed because of COVID and stuff. But I have a newborn baby, so I don't think I can leave the country for a month. I would like to, though.
And she's in St. Petersburg right now.
Oh,
Yeah, highly recommend it when you can.
Speaking of books, Ann Wright bought your book and it came signed. Thank you. That was wonderful. It was really nice to get and open up. All right. Well, it is after 9 p.m. Eastern time. We have another page and a half of questions. We're not going to get to them. However, most of them touch on issues that we will be touching on. So the goal is to have this event monthly moving forward with different guests each time to talk about specific topics in the primer, and this being just the intro to everything. So as we're closing tonight, I want to say thank you to Ann, thank you to Emma Claire, thank you so much to David, especially for writing this piece. It is invaluable, and we are getting it to lots of candidates already, and we're going to be doubling down on that in the weeks to come, making sure there are no candidates who have that excuse of not knowing anything about foreign policy. As you go, a couple things I want to ask of everyone. We had great attendance. We had over 100 people here tonight. The first is go to rootsaction.org, join our mailing list, stay up to date on the things we're talking about and the things we're doing. Please donate to Roots Action as well. That goes a long way for us. I also want to ask you to check out progressivehub.net. Sam, if you want to throw a link there again, that's where we had the Sharon Tennyson article posted. And this is where we have every day the most important news stories right next to actions that you can take right then and there. Write your senator as you're reading an article about why you should write your senator. It's fantastic. I also share this primer everywhere on social media. Great. Share it publicly. Share it with your friends. There's a printable version that'll print great and you can hand it to somebody. And definitely share it with candidates, especially those in your district, because they'll listen to people in their district. Last but not least, if you have your own campaign you want to start, the DIY, the do-it-yourself Roots Action tool is wonderful. Go check that out. Start a campaign, and we might push it out to our own email list if we like it. So yeah, Roots Action, Progressive Hub. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. If your question did not get answered, come to the next couple events because we will get to all of these topics. And Emma, Claire, David, do you guys have anything you want to say before we end the night?
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Ann. Thank you, Emma Claire. Thank you, everybody, with the great questions.
Thank you. Aloha,
Everybody.
That's right. All right, everybody, have a good night and thank you so much.